I got a Greyhound bus pass. You could go 99 days for $99, unlimited mileage. And I set up something like 13 or 17, forget which, interviews around the U.S. to become a buyer at a department store, because I knew the guts of retailing are the buyers, the merchants, the people that pick the goods and price them. There's just no secrets. I was kicked out of Harrods for taking pictures. Sam Walton was famous for getting kicked out of stores for taking pictures. If you're a real ballsy retailer, you walk in the back room, you just start strutting around, I'd sit in parking lots. I still enjoy doing this and count how many bags are coming out, what percent of the people actually bought something, what types of people, what family structure.
Gary, thanks so much for joining me. I've been excited to have this conversation.
Oh, me too. It's great to see you, Siva.
I'd like to, you've had a really interesting career. You owned a business called Bookstop, which you sold to Barnes and Nobles. You built the Hoover's database, which you sold to Dun and Bradstreet. And you run one of my probably my favorite history blog called American Business History. It's such a wonderful blog that I spend a lot of time on.
Great.
I'd like to start.
That.
I love it. And I recommend it to everybody I know, by the way.
That's great.
I'd like to start a little bit about your background. Can you tell me how you got started as an entrepreneur and how you ended up running the bookstore?
Yeah. I'll give it to you as quick as I can. So I grew up in a General Motors factory town, Anderson, Indiana, about a half hour, 45 minutes northeast of Indianapolis. And a town of 60,000 people, 27,000 worked for General Motors. So it was life itself, 7 million square feet of factory buildings. And I'm sitting there in the classroom and the teachers are talking about leadership, about the history of Indiana, governors, generals, French and Indian War, presidents, kings, queens, and really about leadership, about management in a sense, and it was fascinating. And, how these people, how they led and how they made decisions, what their strategies were, whether people liked following them or not and all that. And I'm like, well, this is fascinating, but who runs General Motors? It seems like it's at least as important to our daily lives here in Anderson, Indiana, as the French and Indian War, which I also love all that history. Anyway, nobody can answer my questions. So I was in with my big brother and big sister and parents in the local newsstand. There used to be big newsstands all over America full of magazines and newspapers around the world or whatever. And I discovered a magazine called Fortune. And Fortune magazine out of New York every year lists the 500 biggest companies in America and based on revenue. And the Fortune 500 issue was out. And so in summer of 63, when I was 12, I grabbed that. General Motors was the biggest, most profitable company on earth. They had articles about General Motors. They had articles about this outfit called Ford, which you didn't see many Fords in Anderson, Indiana, and even Chrysler. And I made my parents get me a subscription to it. They thought I was crazy. So I started subscribing to Fortune when I was 12 and just became fascinated with business and big business. And it was like, well, here's this thing that's really important. It's all around us. And yet nobody knows much about it. All of us in Anderson knew what the new Chevy looks like and what the new Plymouth looks like and where the fins were. And we could recognize cars. I still can from, a mile away or whatever. Anyway, and I started studying it. Procter & Gamble, they were all over the house. They were on Crest toothpaste and Crisco, baking stuff and all that.
If you run a holding company or business with multiple entities, you should definitely listen to this. At Enduring Ventures, we have over 50 bank accounts across our different portfolio companies. Our director of finance, Nick, spends every morning going through those accounts one by one and making sure that the cash balance is where he expects it to be. This used to take him an hour or so every single day. There really wasn't an easier way to do it. Then a friend of mine introduced me to Vesto. Vesto makes it easy to connect all of your bank accounts into a simple dashboard. So you get real-time balances, transactions, and cash flow monitoring all in one place with just one login. So Nick got to go from checking 50 different accounts to just checking one account and one dashboard every single day. A job that used to take Nick almost an hour every day now takes him just a couple minutes or less. If you're managing multiple bank accounts, Vesto is a no-brainer. Go to vesto.com, tell them that Sieva sent you, and you'll get to speak directly to the founder, Ben.
And I wrote to them and said, well, tell me your company history and who started it and all that.
How old were you when you wrote to these companies?
I wrote to them, and then gosh, my graduation present from high school, it was either a color TV to take to college, which was a big deal. I convinced my parents to give me a round-trip bus ticket to New York City, and Washington and Philly. And I went to all the corporate headquarters in New York and walked in and said, hi, I want to know about, I went and met with the publisher of Fortune magazine. I was 18, but I'd been a subscriber for 6 years. I did the same thing downtown Chicago, starting when I was 15 or whenever my parents would let me run away from them when we were in Chicago, and go door to door, Inland Steel Company, Container Corporation of America, Sears, Roebuck, whatever was headquartered there. So anyway, fascinated by business. Then I knew I didn't want to major in business in college because I was kind of immersed in it and maybe become too narrow. So I went to the University of Chicago, which doesn't offer undergraduate business, and majored in economics, one step over, but there it's a couple of steps away. Business and economics. But I was lucky to have Milton Friedman and 3 other people who later won Nobel Prizes, and befriended a couple others. So I got a good education in economics. I fell in love with retailing. My dad had been a grocer when I was a really little kid. He got out of it probably when I was 6 or something like that, 7 or 8 maybe. Anyway, but so there was that. But my mom loved to shop and would take us kids to big cities, to like Macy's in New York or Marshall Field's in Chicago or whatever. And I just saw retailing. Oh, it was just wonderful. They were in these beautiful buildings, and there was architecture involved, and I love architecture. There's geography. I love geography, picking locations. You're dealing with people. I love that aspect of it. That's my favorite part, is serving others, being a clerk, basically. It's my favorite part of the deal. And I wanted someday to run a big department store, but that was all kind of vague. Over time, I realized that in retailing, there are tremendous advantages to the entrepreneur. It's a low barrier to entry industry. You don't have to have any fancy degrees. Some of the greatest retailers who ever lived are high school dropouts, as were a lot of the great entrepreneurs. Of course, a different era, different education standards and stuff. To be frank, I noticed, all the hot rods want to go into high tech, or all the hot rods want to go to Goldman Sachs, or want to go to McKinsey, or, whatever. Because I worked at the University of Chicago Graduate Business School all 4 years and became their whole finance world and random walk theory and all that jazz. But anyway, so I was real aware of that. A lot of my friends are in Wall Street finance. But I ended up, got out of college, I decided I'd go to Wall Street and see retailing from the 30,000-foot view, or whatever you want to call it. So I became a junior stock analyst at Citibank. We were one of the 2 or 3 biggest investment management firms. I think we had $100 million under management, and that put us at the top of the list in 1973. Laughable today, I guess. Anyway, and there I worked for an old pro, veteran retail analyst, one of the best on Wall Street, and learned, I was 22 years old, and I'm flying around the U.S. and saying, I want to see the CEO of Sears. I want to see the CEO of JCPenney, of Kmart, of, whoever was hot. Radio Shack was hot. 7-Eleven was a hot company then. Toys R Us had a little different pattern. Anyway, learned a lot, realized after 2 years, okay, I've learned what I can from Wall Street. Because after a while, you realize, or at least I realized, well, first of all, I heard all the economists from Goldman Sachs and Bear Stearns and all these outfits talking. And I realized, well, some of them don't really understand economics, or at least not the way Milton Friedman and I understand economics. And the retail analysts, a couple of them had worked in retailing, but a lot of them never had. And some of the ones who hadn't worked in retailing, they still got it. It was like in their blood or something, maybe relatives or grew up in the back of a store, but I realized maybe 70% of the retail analysts don't really get it, don't really think like a retailer. And so then I said, I got to learn how to be a retailer. I've seen how you analyze it. I've seen how Wall Street looks at it. I've seen the role of earnings per share and relative price multiples and going public and all that. And we studied young startup, companies that are just young IPOs. We invested in some of them, as well as the giants like Sears, Penny, and Kmart were the 3 big holdings. Federated department stores, which became Macy's. Anyway, and the best place to learn in the 70s was a big department store. So I spent a total of 7 years, 2 years with Federated department stores. I got a Greyhound bus pass. You could go 99 days for $99, unlimited mileage. And I set up something like 13 or 17, forget which, interviews around the U.S. to become a buyer at a department store, because I knew the guts of retailing are the buyers, the merchants, the people that pick the goods and price them essentially, and figure out the promotional, the advertising, and everything. Anyway, and I got several offers, pay cuts coming off Wall Street. But the best one was in Dallas, Federated Department Stores, which was the greatest of the big department store companies. Their big Dallas division, Sanger Harris, became the buyer of books. And there, I studied the book industry, and I saw, wow, here's change coming, and it's dominated by these two big outfits, B. Dalton and Walton Books. They're in all the malls. Anyhow, and there was a giant independent store in Dallas called Taylor's, and they did as much revenue as any New York City bookstore, I'm pretty sure. They were just amazing what they were doing. And it's because I had this huge selection. And at the same time, there was a relatively new concept out of the 70s, the Superstore, created by Charles Lazarus at Toys R Us. And the idea was, I'm not going to be a general merchandise store like Sears or Walmart or like that. I'm going to be a specialist. I'm just going to carry one category. He carried toys and hobbies, games, bicycles, kid stuff. And I'm going to have a bigger selection than anybody else and have lower prices. Well, that's the Superstore concept. Generally, you aren't in the mall, because when you get out of a mall, you have lower rent, lower overall costs, parking lot maintenance, all that jazz, common area maintenance, they call it. But you also can be open whatever hours you want. You can be open longer hours. People can park right at the door. They can carry heavy packages right to their car. So there's trade-offs. There's advantages to being in a mall and being out of a mall. And so I saw that. I got hired away by the May Department Stores Company, their competitor in St. Louis, and spent 5 years there, mainly, strategic planning, acquisition research. I think I looked at like 400 different companies we might buy. We bought one called Payless Shoe Source. We bought it for like $160 million, and it later spun out of the company. I think it was worth over $2 billion. Now, later it was over leverage. It was bought, and it went bankrupt, and I think they're trying to revive it now. But it was a huge opportunity. We could see it. I went real deep dive, spent about a year of my life studying the shoe store industry. And that was one of the more successful deals they did. Anyway, and then I realized I'd learned merchandising. I'd learned the finance, hiring and firing. I'd learned a whole lot from just being lucky to have great bosses. The Dallas experience, I just got lucky, and the rising star was the head of that division. And so learn, from all these people. And finally took the plunge in 1982, decided to start the first chain of giant bookstores, book superstores, take the Toys R Us model, adapt it. Picked Austin. It beat out Research Triangle, North Carolina, Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Madison, Wisconsin, based on the data. All data, all the way driven. Study the numbers. You got to also use intuition and human things too, but 7 years later, we were coast to coast, Miami to San Diego. Venture capitalists fired me. Barnes & Noble bought it a couple of months later. Has done a great job with it, but Borders came along later. Tom Borders is a friend of mine, but I think we had 12 stores open by the time they opened their second one. And then Borders and Barnes & Noble had kind of their battle that Barnes & Noble won, and we could go on and on about the evolution of the book retailing industry. But anyway, so that was called Book Stop. It was called Bookstar in some cities. Redid some old movie theaters, which still stand. There's one in Studio City, California, Point Loma in San Diego. We did a big one in Houston, but it's now a Trader Joe's. Anyway, I'm in love with retailing. After that, I'd always been interested in business information. It's kind of, the buzzword these days would be opaque, If you wanted to understand a big company, you had to go to a library or a stockbroker's office and get these giant books called Moody's manuals. There's the red, the red book, those are Moody's manuals right there. Anyway, and about $5,000 for a set of them that have all the annual reports of all the companies, essentially. And they've been around since I think I have volume 1, number 1, 1900 here somewhere. Anyhow, well, I said, that's ridiculous. People are there going out looking for jobs, and they want to know, okay, I just got out of the Air Force. I'm a pilot. Should I go to work for Pan American Airways or Southwest Airlines? Well, lots of people went to work for Pan Am because it was much bigger and more famous. Well, if they looked at an annual report or asked a Wall Street analyst, they would say, no, 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 go to work for Southwest, not Pan Am, not Eastern, not TWA, right? And all sorts of things. People buying stock and everything, and yet there's no reference book to companies. So came out with a book called Hoover's Handbook, Guide to the 542 Most Important Companies in the World, one page on each, a $19.95 paperback. Still one of the best reference books on business ever written. It's one of the best index books ever done. My old college buddies and I got together. Anyway, that morphed. It was called the Reference Press. It was going to be the Webster's of business. Well, I realized being in a business where I couldn't see my customers all the time and touch my customers in a sense wasn't right for me. I turned that over to an old college buddy, Patrick Spain. He morphed it into an online service. The first book was called Hoover's Handbook because it was easier to protect by using my name. The company wasn't called that. Well, it got known as Hoover's. He created Hoovers.com, ended up, went public, and then was sold to Dun & Bradstreet. But by then, I'd gone on to a retail business, created the first travel superstore, a whole nother story. It's all written. Both Bookstop and Travel Fest are written up on the American Business History website, the full story. But in any case, and it failed when the airlines stopped paying commissions on airline tickets to travel agents. It was an everything store: books, language classes, currency exchange, luggage, Dramamine pills, everything. And it was a huge success. We did triple our revenue projection, but we couldn't get to profitability. I borrowed over $1 million. Personally, I didn't own Bookstop and own, Hoover's. I owned a share of each. I had backers in all my deals. And so I lost all my money that I'd made on the first two on Travel Fest. And I kind of dabbled around in a few other things. I've taught a lot. I was the first entrepreneur in residence at the McCombs Business School at the University of Texas at Austin. That was wonderful. I've been to 45 countries and 49 states teaching and preaching entrepreneurship. That's where we met, in Guatemala, as I recall. And then, I wouldn't call it retirement, but whatever, old age, I said, well, if you Google business history, any subject you look up, any kind of odd kind of parakeet or type of rock or small village in Northern Ireland, anything you look up's got a website or two or three. You do business history, there was nothing, universities, but most academics aren't that interested in popularizing, and making it readable and fun. And some are, but most aren't. They're into impressing other academics. So even the business history professors, they aren't out there, saying, hey, look at this. And there's so much to be learned. I mean, you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you're coming from. And there's nothing that matters that's new in business. I mean, the techniques matter, whether you use the telegraph to advertise or billboards or YouTube ads, yeah. But the basics, the things that matter, don't change. And the lessons, and I believe the best way to learn entrepreneurship, to learn how to think like an entrepreneur, is to study the greats. And I just turned down a request. Somebody wanted me to write up something. Well, write up, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Bezos and Musk. And I said, no, why would I do that? There's 6 million people writing about them, of whom at least a few hundred know more about them than I do, So I pretty much only write about dead people now. Jobs qualifies now, but still, it's a little early to judge, I mean, the thing when you study a Sears Roebuck, which was the greatest retailer on earth for like 40, 50 years, you can see the birth, you can see the rise, you can see all the things he did right, and you see all the things he did wrong, and then you can see the decline, and you can see, in its case, the complete death of the company. Mm-hmm. And so you really can look at that big picture and understand more than you could say today about Amazon or Apple, because we don't yet know how they turn out, So, and they're fascinating, and I love studying them, but I'm not going to take my time, writing them up when there's so much to be learned from business history. And we've got hundreds of articles, videos, charts, all kinds of stuff on the website. And I'm out of breath. There's my whole life, or a big piece of it. I love to travel, and I love geography, and I collect books, and there are other parts of my life too.
No, that's a wonderful high level overview, and I think a good place to start. I'm curious, back if you think back to your May department store days, what do you remember? What caught your eye about Payless shoes? I remember Payless shoes. I grew up wearing Payless shoes for years.
Oh yeah. They started out their advertising line when they started out. The Poses family from Topeka, Kansas, the two cousins, was man alive, 2 pair for $5, and it was 2 pairs of shoes for $5. Um, we looked at all these companies. David Farrell was our CEO. I reported to a guy who 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 reported to him, kind of thing. But once I started working with him on acquisitions, I was just he'd call me up Sunday morning at home at 7 a.m. say, "Can you get down here? I got something I want to show you." He was the hardest working man I ever worked with, the CEO of the company. Just had to have 2 crews of pilots on the corporate jet because they weren't allowed to work the kind of hours that he worked, Anyway, but we looked at all sorts of things, but the big department stores, they really understand apparel and accessories. They understand apparel, they understand jewelry, shoes, furs in the old days, and lingerie and everything. And so, and that's where they made most of their money, and still do, Macy's, which is what all those companies became. So shoes were natural. It was clearly a changing industry. Yeah, the old giants were a company called Kinney Shoes and a company called Tom McCann. They were the giants that were in all the malls. And looking around, and I had a piece of paper where the CEO had written in the Wall Street Journal, they have the earnings report, and he saw their quarterly earnings report, and it was really good. And he said, "What do we know about these guys?" And wrote it on there, sent a note to my boss, and handed it to me. And then I dove in for the next year. And they're incredible. They were clearly an incredibly well-run company. These two cousins, Lewis and Shale Poses from Topeka, Kansas, they were among the best merchants I ever studied. And just the way they ran their company, they had thousands, whatever, maybe they had 1,000 then. They had a bunch of these tiny stores that did very low revenue per store, but they had extremely high gross margins. They made all their product abroad, and they would buy the complete shoe output of factories all over the world. And that was before the rise of China. We're back in the 70s, so probably Southeast Asia, Central America. Anyway, maybe Philippines. And they could sell them 2 pair for $5 and still make a lot of money. By the time I was involved, they'd gone up from 2 pair for $5, but they were still a bargain. But they were just great merchants. And I thought the May Company would mess it up. I really liked the May Company. I worked with great people. It was a true meritocracy. It was just full of really interesting, bright people. But still, it's a big company, bureaucracy. We were doing over $1 billion a year back then, which was big at the time. But they didn't. They did a good job with it. They expanded it. They really put the pedal to the metal, and they made it the biggest shoe store chain in America. And they spun it out to the shareholders as a benefit to the shareholders, and it was still cooking at that time. But no, we looked at everything. I offered him my bookstore idea. I went to him. This has happened repeatedly in retailing. The inventor of the supermarket couldn't sell his bosses on the idea, so he went off and did it on his own. Guys that started Home Depot were fired. Sam Walton tried to convince Ben Franklin, the dime store chain he was affiliated with, to open these small-town discount stores. They wouldn't listen to him. So no, I said, hey, here's my business plan for this chain of book superstores. Does May Company want to back it? And they said, it's not the right cup of tea for us, which I wasn't surprised and expected, and left and did it. But a lot of what you're doing in retail M&A, strategic planning, is geographical. We were too light in the Sun Belt. We had a nice store in Portland. We had a big operation in Washington, and we were one of the big 2 of our type in L.A., along with a store called the Broadway. And but we weren't in Florida, we weren't in Texas, we weren't in the Southeast. And we had a little tiny store in Jacksonville, Florida. But and later, after I left the company, they bought Foley's, which was the biggest department store in Texas. And they made more progress in the Sun Belt. But then it later all became Macy's. Macy's bought them. But,
you mentioned your CEO at the May department stores was the hardest working man you've ever seen. And when I was reading the Sam Walton biography, it felt the same. And I wonder, is there some similarity in retail? Does it take some insane work effort? Sam had his executives come in on Saturdays and Sundays at 7 in the morning.
Yeah, Sam's my hero. I just took a little vacation trip to Arkansas and Missouri, and I visited the Sam Walton Museum. They're redoing it, so they've got a small temporary one. But I talked for about an hour and a half with the young man who was working there, telling the Walmart story. I drove by Sam's house where he lived. I tried to emulate what his drive to work would have been when he opened that first Walmart in Rogers, Arkansas in 1962. It would have been all fields, all rural, between his hometown of Bentonville and nearby Rogers where he opened it. Well, now it's one of the fastest growing places in America. It's growing almost as fast as Austin, Northwest Arkansas. It's just incredible. The thing is, to be a great retailer, I define a merchant as somebody who loves the merchandise and loves the customer. And so you've got to, you have to, I study so many tech companies, and, I've counseled, I bet you I've seen like 10,000 business plans and judged all these business plan competitions on campuses and all the time I spent at University of Texas at Austin. And so over half the people I dealt with are in technology one way or another. And there's just a whole different mindset when you're in retailing. First of all, you're in it because you love the competition. And if you're good at it, you respect the competition. When I've spoken at South by Southwest and all this stuff, and hang out at the cocktail party or whatever. Oh, Apple's a bunch of idiots. Oh, Microsoft's a bunch of idiots. Oh, those guys at CrowdStrike don't know what they're doing, or, and it's like retailers have a whole different perspective on the competition. I've done some History Channel shows on the history of Walmart and Costco and all that jazz. And they always want to create drama, like, oh, these guys hated each other and they were going to slay each other. No, first of all, there's no secrets. There's no patents. There's no intellectual property. Nothing that really matters. Yeah, I'm sure Walmart has, patented some of their technologies and stuff. But, I can walk into, when I was doing department stores and doing the acquisitions, and a lot of what we looked at was to buy other department stores. How could we buy that big store in New Orleans to get into the South or whatever? And I could walk into any department store in the country, and this is back when I was in my 20s, and I could, even if it's a privately owned company with no public financials, I could walk around that store, go back out to my car, and write their P&L down on a piece of paper. Because I knew their wages, because all you'd have to do is, ask or apply for a job, but you also know what industry standard was in that market. You knew their rent. You knew the industry. You could figure that out. You could look through their store and tell their mix between high margin and low margin goods, imported goods and not imported, and all that jazz, and how big was apparel and how big were hard goods and appliances, if they carried all that. You could figure their gross margin. You knew their pricing. Their pricing is on everything. You knew their vendor structure. You know who they bought from, which suppliers they used, and you could pencil that thing out. There's just no secrets. You can walk into any store in America. And when you're a real, Sam Walton, I was kicked out of Harrods for taking pictures. Sam Walton was famous for getting kicked out of stores for taking pictures. If you're a real ballsy retailer, you walk in the back room, you just start strutting around, I'd sit in parking lots. I still enjoy doing this and count how many bags are coming out, what percent of the people actually bought something, what types of people, what family structure. But the thing is, you gotta love the customers above all else. You gotta believe in your heart that the highest calling is to serve others, to somehow, if you can unite a customer with something they're looking for or they need and don't know they need, or the book, and I had a bad day at Bookstop, and there were days when I had to have the investors' Federal Express checks to cover payroll, and, there's always bad days, or usually, a startup. To clear my head on the way home from work, I just go to the stores and wait on people. And the minute you had a customer say, oh, I didn't know there was a book like that, or, oh, I've been looking for this for 3 years, I could go home and sleep like a baby because I knew what we were doing, had value. It made somebody's life better, more interesting anyway. I said Sam Walton's goal in life was to make everybody's life more affordable. My goal in life was always to make other people's lives more interesting, selling books. And really, Hoover's was education, was helping people understand information about business. All the things I've done have in a broad sense been about education and learning and curiosity, which is the value I've put. Well, my title on my Sam Walton article was How Curiosity and Humility Built the World's Largest Company. It's I think still close to twice as big as any other company. Maybe Aramco is approaching it, but It's just unbelievable what they pull off every day. And this week they announced incredible results, financial results for last quarter, and then Target this morning announced awful. So, and that's another great company that I interviewed for a job with and know all about. But
the Walmart stock is booming this year. What I'd like to know is there's these stories like Federated and May. It looks like they merged. They became Macy's. Now Macy's is struggling. What do you think these businesses did wrong that maybe companies like
yeah,
Walmart have done
I
better
have
over the
strong
years?
opinions on that because I was involved in the planning for the department stores too. That was my first job at May. I mean, we own shopping malls all over America, and I did monthly sales projections for 3,000 specialty stores like 3 years into the future to figure out what our rental income would be on the shopping center. So, but I was really immersed in which department stores are doing well. Man, I had all the numbers memorized. My own opinion, they began to all look alike. I call it the blindfold test. If you go into a Macy's or a Dillard's, or if you step back 20 years, every city had 2 or 3 different names there, right? In Southern California, the big ones, well, Sears was by far the biggest. Penny's and Ward's were big, but it was the Broadway May Company. They were 2 big volume mid-range stores, and an upscale was Robinson's and Bullock's, you know? And then there were giant discount stores. Kmart was the huge one for a long time. But they each were different. One would have a better restaurant. One would have a better children's clothing. And they had personalities. The buyers, the people that ran them, were in that city. Even when Federated department stores had stores like Bloomingdale's in New York and Bullock's in California, Burdine's in Miami, Foley's in Texas, Lazarus in Ohio, they were run independently and had different business models to some degree. They had personality. Well, over time, they kind of sold out to their vendors. First of all, they pursued gross margin percent. And so their highest gross margin percent were in apparel. So they became big apparel stores. They dropped televisions. They dropped sporting goods, they dropped books, they dropped stationery, they dropped pets, they dropped appliances, they dropped electronics, one by one. And interestingly, apparel is one of the slower growing categories over time. And if you look at the period I'm talking about, which is really roughly 1975 to the present, growth has been in auto parts, sporting goods, home improvement, pets. Books rose for a long time, actually still a reasonably strong category. The categories that grew, they basically got out of because they wanted those high gross margin percent. Now, a discount store the only true department store that has departments, everything left in America really is Walmart. Target is a close second, but I noticed the other day even they don't have an auto parts section. Well, in the old days, stores like Macy's had all that stuff. They were
really?
the everything store. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because now I just know them as clothing, and some housewares. That's all I know.
Yeah,
Macy's
yeah.
has.
And they still, some of them have furniture departments. Bloomingdale's is famous for its home furnishings. And the other thing is a lot of their high profit key areas got picked off one by one. You know, I went after books, but books were already very minor in department stores. Used to be department stores were the biggest places you bought books from. You'd go to Macy's or Marshall Field's. That's where most Americans bought books, going back 80, 100 years, whatever. But, you know, Ulta has picked them off in cosmetics. Linens and things in Bed Bath & Beyond picked them off in domestics, sheets and towels and all that, which is a big profit center for them. But that industry got kind of screwed up, and both those companies went away. But one by one, and you know, in sporting goods, you got Dick's and all this, a lot of Change, Academy. They've always been specialty stores, but so a lot of factors going on. And they also just got kind of sleepy. I remember going to our big San Diego store and going back to headquarters and, man, that store hadn't been remodeled in 10 years. I mean, and I wrote a letter. A friend of mine's one of the biggest shopping mall owners in the world. And I said, I just reviewed one of your big malls in Texas. And I'll try to remember exactly what I told him. I said, what was it? It's the Dillard's looks like a department store from 1975. Macy's looks like a department store from 1985, and Nordstrom looks like a department store from 1995. And it's 2015, you know. And I raised like $6 million to start a for-profit museum. I went to 600 museums around the world and have written about that on some of the websites and stuff. And it's like, you go to the Singapore airport, you go to Good Science or Children's Museum, you're going to see giant dynamic videos. You know, you go to the Singapore or Hong Kong airport, it's like Disney World, right? I mean, there's videos going on, there's action, there's a zoo in the airport or whatever, a jungle, you know, gardens. It's just so engaging. That's my word, engaging. In the 1970s, when a new department store, a new Federated store opened in the market, it was the buzz of the town. There were crowds. If you go back 100 years, there were like 200,000 people come to the grand opening of a big new downtown department store, Macy's or something in
Wow,
New
I
York.
had no idea.
Oh yeah, oh man, oh the book stop, the last book stop that we opened right about the time Barnes and Noble bought us. The fire marshal closed it down because it was beyond the building capacity. How many people could hold at a book stop, at a bookstore grand opening? But no, department stores and the architecture, they were doing very advanced things. You go out to Northridge Center there where they built the Bullocks in the 70s. It was Corten steel that was all one color, and as the store aged, the store changed colors, and that made all the architecture magazines. No, there was a long history of showmanship, of engaging people. And you can make a case that Costco does a better job of showmanship now because of the action, because of the forklift trucks moving around and just the whole, it's a show. The department stores forgot all that. You know, they had big auditoriums. You know, I remember as a young man working as a department store buyer in Dallas, me and the whole male accounting department went down to the competing department store's auditorium to see the Farrah Fawcett look-alike contest, which in Dallas, Texas in 1975, there are a lot of women with as much hair as Farrah Fawcett. No, they were show places. They were events. You went there to learn how to cook. Macy's had all these demonstrations in the aisles and magicians doing tricks in the aisles of their big New York store, even in the 70s. And, you know, that's merchandising. That's real retailing. And real, I mean, Sam Walton was he was ultimate retailer to the bone, everything in his bones. Now, his whole life was about saving people money, really, you know, but if you study his life, I mean, this sounds really arrogant, but every time and I have all the books about him and everything, I really feel akin to him in terms of my reaction to things, my thoughts about competition, my feeling about the merchandise, my attitudes towards customers. But a lot of it came from my dad, who'd had this grocery store, and he'd come to the bookstore openings, and you know, he'd see
Yeah,
some
as you were
customer
talking,
halfway
I
across the
noticed
store
some
lost, and he'd
similarities.
say, "Look, you know, drop what you're doing. There's a customer that needs help." You know, and that's real retailing. And that's one reason I wasn't successful in digital businesses and stuff. It's so much harder to know your customer when you're working through a screen. It's a huge disadvantage that people don't realize.
Have you been to some of the malls that Rick Caruso has built here in Los Angeles? I got the pleasure to meet him last week, and as you talk about showmanship and
So is the
um,
Grove or
the
what?
Grove, yeah,
Yeah,
the
I know.
Grove,
No, I know the Grove. Sure. You know,
yeah,
that concept was created by Leslie Wexner in Columbus, Ohio, at Easton Town Center. That idea of the big open air with some lodging and maybe housing and offices. Leslie Wexner's the guy that built the Limited and Victoria's Secret and everything. And
mm,
he's the guy that he
I
and a
didn't know that.
partner in Columbus, Ohio. And then they were copied all over the U.S. in the Grove in L.A., Atlantic Crossing and Atlanta, the Domain in Austin. They're all over America now. But the Grove might be the biggest one. And what other kinds of things is he doing,
Um,
Caruso?
yeah, so he has a number of malls out here. I think one of them's in Glendale. It's called like the Mall of America or something like that. He has one in the Palisades, which is similar to the Grove. So he's a number of these outdoor type malls. And I got to see
Uh-huh.
him speak the other day, and
Yeah.
he was talking about how his primary mission statement or value, I guess, for his employees is how do we create joy and enjoyment for our customers, right? So it's less about how do we make more money, how do we eke out the highest rents. It's how do we create a space that people want to go to. So here at the Grove, I'm sure you've seen it. They have a trolley, and he was talking about. He's like, yeah, we have a trolley. It doesn't make us any money, but little kids love to go on the trolley. And on a Tuesday afternoon, they'll tell their mom, hey, I want to go on the trolley. And he doesn't say it, but I'm sure, once mom gets to the trolley at the Grove, she stops by Sephora, buys a few things,
Oh yeah.
and it creates this kind of virtuous cycle. If you go there 2 days a week, there's live music, there's a variety of different events. It's a really cool place to hang out.
Yeah, no. And I think all great retail landlords and mall developers, they think like retailers, I mean, the best of them. The Simon family from Indiana, where I'm from, are the big owners, and I think they're retailers. I mean, they just think that when they went in to save J.C. Penney, they and a partner bought it out of bankruptcy to keep it open. So they actually do operate some retail stores, and they bought some other brands that were in trouble that they wanted to help keep around. But yeah, and I mean, the best retailer in the country is probably Disney World, Disneyland. I mean, if you study their food service, if you go on one of their cruises, I mean, they think like retailers in that end of the Disney empire, at very high margins and quite successful at drawing crowds. So,
Yeah, it's
store.
interesting to hear you say they think like retailers. For me, they're like experiential, they're theatrical,
Yes,
but I guess
yeah.
there's a real overlap there.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm saying is historically retailers are very theatrical and experiential, and they've lost a lot of it. Now, some have come back. A friend of mine from the May Company, the gal that sat next to me, my buddy, she created Build-A-Bear Workshop, and that, experiential retailing. And my venture to go into the travel thing, the whole idea, because one of the things when I look at strategies going forward, like what would I do today if I was in my 20s and starting out? That's why I started moving towards the museum space. But museum's a weird word because I was working on for-profit, really retailtainment or edutainment or some stupid buzzword like that. But the world is moving from buying stuff to buying services. The U.S. was probably majority service economy around 1950. I mean, manufacturing had already peaked 70 years ago, and the whole globe. I was thinking, I was working on some stuff I hope to write here soon, but I was saying, okay, when I was a kid, at every major intersection there were 2 or 3 gas stations, and now today at every major intersection there's 2 or 3 banks, and in 20 years, every major intersection, or 10 years, every major intersection is going to have 2 or 3 emergency medical clinics.
Mm-hmm. They're everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere I went on this 3,000-mile drive. It took 3 weeks in October just to not listen to politics and news for a while and get out. I love to drive and hit the road. Everywhere you go, all the cranes, construction cranes, they're all building hospitals. That's all we're building in America. Every little town, every big city, every corner, minor emergent orthopedic center, eye care center, dental franchises. No, it's just, it's the biggest industry in America, this healthcare monster. And it's just going to get bigger with an aging population, and the pill makers are going nuts, and the government's going nuts, and who should pay for how and how much. And it's an incredibly complex field. I've got one of my mentees, people I mentor right now, has got ideas in healthcare, and I wrote him a long email about, well, here are the pros and cons. But I said but it's enormous. The opportunities, even the tiny ones, like a better crutch or a better cast if you break your ankle. Well, that's so small it doesn't even show up in the numbers. Medical accessories or whatever they call it. Wheelchairs. Well, the thing is enormous, and who pays for it? But the change is we're going to so financial services, travel services, educational services, health services. So I really, if I started today, and the thing I was working on with some museums and other ideas of mine was really to sell less goods and move more into services. And those retailers that can execute services, so like PetSmart, in some of their stores, you can have the pet boarded, you can have it groomed, you can have it washed, and you can have it trained. Well, those are all businesses PetSmart wasn't in when it started. It's a big place to sell dog food, is what it is, and sell a few toys on the side. But they're moving massive amounts of pet food, which has exploded. And when an industry grows, you look at pet food, the fragmentation, we had talked about acquisitions and buying and selling companies. Well, when an industry grows dramatically, when I was a kid, it was Dog Chow and then a couple of others. There was Kennel Ration and Dog Food in a Can and Gaines Burgers and all that. But Purina owned the industry, and now that's part of Nestle. But now you look at the Farmer's Dog and Blue Mountain or whatever, Blue something. It's incredible, the fragmentation. Same thing. There used to be just big sporting goods stores. Well, now there's outdoor stores like REI. There's fishing and hunting stores, Bass Pro and Cabela's. There's fitness equipment stores. There's still general sporting goods stores. But when an industry grows, it fragments. More segments are created. But then when it dies, so like the department stores, when I was working in the May company, well, my first job was competitive analysis. And I studied, there were like, say, 7 or 8 big department store operators. Each one of us had ones in different cities. We all had them scattered around the U.S. Well, 7 of those 8 companies are now Macy's. They all got merged into one company. Dillard's and Nordstrom are the only ones that are left outside there. And one privately held one in Pennsylvania called Boscov's. It's the only survivor out of probably hundreds of family-owned stores. The only one I can find are the biggest ones in the
Boscov's.
US.
They're a client for one of my businesses.
Oh, really?
Oh,
yeah. Really? Well,
we do
because there were hundreds of those family-owned department stores all over America, and that's the biggest one I can find that still survives like that as a private company.
Why do you think these businesses merged?
Well, I think that's a sign of the decline of the industry. As the industry goes down in importance, it's still a multi-billion-dollar thing, but it has a fraction of the market share it had when I worked in it 40 years ago or whatever. So as it goes into decline, they consolidate, The newspapers, as they died off, they all began to merge, into groups. Or they always had, but it took a different form. There are other industries like banking has consolidated a lot, although there's still a lot of small banks. Airlines, although there are new airlines. And that might be a sign that there's some maybe maturity in the industry. It's hard to say. The industry, like the auto industry, started out with 2,000 companies or whatever, and then it shook out to a dozen or so, and then it shook out to 3, and then it stayed at 3 for 40 years, and then it bloomed, and again, dozens, if not hundreds, of automakers around the world. So, these things follow different patterns.
Gary, I want to talk to you a little bit about conglomerates in general and acquisition companies. I know they're really popular in the late 1900s, and now we have a number of conglomerates as well. On your Business American History site, you write about a few different conglomerates. So I want to
Beatrice Foods,
I was actually going to mention a few names. I want to hear which ones you want to pick out and talk about. So the ones I've seen on your site are Beatrice Foods, like you just said, General Foods, Standard Brands, LTV, Ling Temco Vought, International Telephone and Telegraph, Gulf and Western Industries, Textron, and Teledyne. Do any of those in particular stand out to you as ones that you want to talk about?
I mean, here's the thing. So the U.S. has had a bunch of merger waves. The first big one was in the 1890s, and that's when they created these big trusts, generally modeled after John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust. There are, the introduction of the Sherman Act and all that jazz, the antitrust laws. They were really fighting the railroads originally, which were so powerful and really, like the Pennsylvania Railroad, its market cap in 1900, it was more important than like NVIDIA and Tesla and Microsoft and Google and Meta combined. I mean, it was all about railroads. And gradually other industries began to go public. Very gradually, it was after the turn 1900 that really retailers began to go public and non-railroads. Utilities had gone public, the power companies. But so in the 1890s, there was a merger wave. And there were all these big trusts formed. And a lot of companies we know today, Aluminum Company of America, General Electric, were formed in that era. And then in the 20s, the boom of the 20s, there was another huge merger wave. Wall Street went crazy. Average individuals in the 20s began to invest in stocks. In fact, the greatest of the stock brokerage firms, Merrill Lynch, Charlie Merrill, he wanted to be like Safeway stores, which he was involved in creating. He wanted to create a chain of brokerage houses. So in the 20s, you had a lot more individuals speculating. That led to the great crash because the margin requirements weren't as tight as they are today. You could borrow a lot more, and when it went down, it really went down. Anyway, so there was a merger wave in the 20s, and then there was a merger wave in the 60s, and that was the conglomerate era. And since then, it strikes me, at least since the 80s, it's been more continuous. There haven't been like a wait 30 or 40 years for another wave, you know? There have been months where it's been no merger and acquisition activity under the regulations of the Biden administration. They really got cold feet, and then when they really dropped off, it looks like maybe it'll crank back up now. That's what most Wall Street people are thinking under the new administration. But there have been big mergers pretty continuously over like the last 30 years. If you go back to the conglomerate era, and I'm a kind of a strict constructionist on the use of words. So conglomerates were companies that were formed in the 50s and really 60s, led by Litton Industries was the first big one that I remember. But Textron, a lot of people consider Textron the original one. They bought totally unrelated companies. And the logic was, well, I'm like the portfolio manager. And if one industry goes down, this other one will do better. It'll balance out. I'll just run it by the numbers. If a company, I don't care what industry it's in, we can run any industry. A good manager can run any company. I personally think it's bullshit, right? Bill Gates could not have created Walmart. Sam Walton could not have created Netflix. Walt Disney could not have created J.P. Morgan Chase. No. People at their heart love an industry, are good at something. Now, you can do different things serially. Bill Gates moved from being a tech brilliant leader, business person to being a philanthropist. But these conglomerates, so they, and the greatest, I think, was International Telephone and Telegraph, run by a guy named Harold Janine. They bought Sheraton Hotels. They bought Hartford Insurance. They bought all kinds of stuff.
Wow.
Well,
they're a phone company that bought a hotel chain.
Well, they were the AT&T of outside the U.S., kind of, and they had cable operations put together by these guys named the Benz, B-E-N-E-S, Sosthenes Benz. Fortune magazine was started by writing an article about ITT because it was a real secretive company. It owned all these telephone systems in like the Philippines and Spain and everything. Anyway, but yeah, Harold Janine got control of it and then used their capital to buy all these other industries. But it was crazy. Jimmy Ling Temco Vought, he bought Aerospace, LTV. He bought Okanite, I think it was carpet company. He bought Jones and Laughlin Steel, which was the third or fourth biggest U.S. steel producer. Just totally unrelated. RCA, which was the greatest consumer electronics company on earth, gave us color TV, all this stuff. They bought Random House Book Publishing. They bought Hertz Rent-A-Car. And, well, the whole... And Beatrice Foods bought like a company a week. They were among the most diverse, although a lot of it was still in food. But they had Airstream trailers, Samsonite luggage. The list is on the story I wrote of all the things they owned. It's just amazing. Cheese companies, lunch meat companies. Anyhow, well, that model didn't work. The conglomerate model was disproven. All those companies, when they failed, when the founders retired or died, their successors broke them up into pieces and sold off all the pieces. Because you want leaders to be focused. You know, the people going to work. John Deere was founded in 1837. And the people at John Deere going to work every day know we make agricultural equipment. Now, they've diversified into construction equipment, even using the same yellow colors as their arch rival in that area, Caterpillar. But companies like John Deere, Caterpillar, PACCAR, one of my favorites, P-A-C-C-A-R, they make Peterbilt and Kenworth trucks. All they think about is how do we make the best trucks in the world? They charge like a 15% premium for the same horsepower as the German-made trucks because they're so much better. The German-made is Freightliner out of Portland, Oregon, is a big U.S. player owned by Daimler Daimler-Benz. So the conglomerates basically all died, and what I would say in speeches as of a few years ago, there were only two left, General Electric and Berkshire Hathaway. Now, General Electric has been busted up. Culp has come in and is saving that thing, and it's the stocks that spun off are all going up. They had record results for their energy. The energy stock was up. GE Vernova, whatever, was up this week, and the core GE, which is now an aerospace company, is doing well. Berkshire Hathaway to me isn't really a true conglomerate. It really is a private equity fund that's public, and it gets blurred because Blackstone is public now, Apollo is public. Although I tried to look up yesterday Blackstone, what all they own, and it's not easy to find a list. Whereas Berkshire Hathaway, go to their 10K, their annual report to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and you can see every single friggin' thing they own, which is a lot, And just like a hedge fund or something, they have this flexibility. They can buy big chunks of stock in a publicly traded company. They can buy a whole company like Warren bought the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, the biggest railroad in America. He bought 100% of it, and Geico and
Sherwin-Williams as well. I think he owns. I think Berkshire owns the paint company, right?
He owns a paint company. He owns a competitor. I forget which one. He owns it. One of the ones we'd recognize if we named it. I think he wholly owns one of the paint companies. I'm drawing a blank on the name of the brand. But in any case, Sherwin-Williams is a public company, separate.
Benjamin Moore.
Yeah, you got it, Benjamin Moore. So,
do you think it
the conglomerate's dead. Now, people use the word loosely. They'll talk about a media conglomerate or a retail conglomerate. Well, I would call that a highly diversified media company or a highly diversified retail company. It's a different concept from what Janine was doing, and those guys.
Right. So maybe maybe a conglomerate where you're across a variety of different industries doesn't make sense because you're perhaps lacking focus. But a buyout, maybe in the same industry or similar industries, does make sense. So, for example, like Beatrice Foods, they owned Tropicana at some point, Krispy Kreme, Dannon. Do you think there are situations where it does make sense to buy out?
Yeah, when companies get big and they can no longer grow organically or in their base business, they're always looking for more opportunities. Now, that's kind of a warning sign. I remember when McDonald's, they bought that Kidzoodle or something. They bought a kids thing, and they also had another restaurant chain. But anyway, they got back to their basics and gave up on that.
They bought Chipotle at one point, and then they didn't work out for them. They sold it.
And they may have started something too. Toys R Us, when they got mature, they opened Babies R Us, and it wasn't quite as successful, I don't think. Even I've made the case that Walmart shouldn't have opened Sam's Club, that if they'd taken that same capital and focused it on the Walmart stores, that would be a higher return to their shareholders. Now, that's one of my favorite companies, and they're doing amazingly well now. So it's hard to knock them. But no, focus is so important. So when you start, but it depends on which numbers you hear. 50 to 70% of all acquisitions turn out bad. Don't live up to expectations. I remember A.G. Lafley. He ran Procter & Gamble in the 90s, right? He ran it for 10 years, picked his successor. That didn't work out, and they brought him back for a few years. But I met him actually when he'd retired before they brought him back, because he had really turned around Procter & Gamble. But he said in his research, he looked at all the acquisitions they'd made, and it was something like, I'm inventing this, but 20 or 30% of them had achieved the goals that they'd written down when they bought the company. Mm-hmm. And so he set a corporate goal to hit 50%. If 50% of the things we buy turn out as good as we think they will, and that was his goal. Now, he bought Gillette. It's a very interesting deal because at the time, huge, wonderful brand, huge money machine, Gillette, all through its history. And then, Harry's and Dollar Shave Club and Dollar a Day and all these things come along. And Procter & Gamble bought one of those, but Unilever, their British arch rival, bought one of the others. So I'm actually not sure how the Gillette deal turned out, because that was kind of his hallmark, big deal. But, final ones. On the other hand, Whole Foods, I was on the board of Whole Foods for 4.5 years in their early days when they went public, Whole Foods Market. But John Mackey and his team over there, I want to say they bought 25 or 30 health food stores around the country, regional chains. I think it was called Mrs. Gooch's, maybe, that was all over California. but scattered around the U.S. Bread and Circus in Boston. There was a big one in North Carolina. Well, those are people that shared the same culture. They all knew each other. They'd all been going to the same suppliers and stuff. And a lot of them, hey, hippie running a health food store. I hate dealing with lawyers. I hate dealing with accountants, meeting with venture capitalists. I'd want to shoot myself in the head. And John basically went in and said, well, I'm fine doing all that. I'll take that off your shoulders. I'll give you stock in Whole Foods Market, put your store in ours. And I want to say that like all but one were successful of those acquisitions because they had that cultural fit. Other cases, like when American Airlines took over TWA, I know they went to great lengths to try to integrate the company gradually and understand it. Now, I'm not close enough situation to know how everybody felt after the fact, because a lot of those so-called mergers, which are really acquisitions, the tail wags the dog, or a lot of unhappy. When United bought Continental Airlines, that was kind of a mess for a while, because you could see the flight attendants, they still wore the wings from their old airline. Mm-hmm. And the grumpy ones were at United and the happy ones were at Continental. And United bought Continental because Continental was doing better and had a better culture. And they let the Continental people run the company, but they made them call it United and leave the headquarters in Chicago instead of Houston. So, yeah, big mergers like that. And Daimler buying Chrysler, I thought it was a winner. I wrote that in my first book because they had a nice mix of Daimler is great in trucks and buses. Chrysler made Jeeps. And anyway, and I thought it would work, and it was a disaster. And of all things, Fiat, another disaster company, is like the third one to try to save Chrysler after Cerberus, the U.S. private equity guys, had failed. After Daimler, the world great car maker, Mercedes-Benz, had failed. The crazy Sergio Marchionne, Italian guy, turns it around and makes it a big success. And now it's called Stellantis, and it's one of the big global automakers, includes Chrysler. So it's hard to tell how things will turn out. But
why do you
but
think it's
organic growth, great companies do the same thing over and over again and get it nailed. And like your bolt-on acquisitions, Warren Buffett's always say, yeah, sure, it makes sense for John Deere to buy a company that makes an attachment to its machines, or something. But man, you got to be careful. And the spin-off thing's going to get bigger and bigger. More opportunities for investors looking for companies to buy because they go in waves. They buy up everything and what for me is a great tragedy is great brands that are mismanaged. And I've written about that because, it was a joke really, but I used to say, hey, if I had run Kool-Aid, there would be no vitamin water. I mean, you with me? I mean, when I was a kid, Kool-Aid was like everywhere. It was a red pitcher with a smiling face on it, and Jell-O, and those are both General Foods products, and they were in every kitchen in America, and everybody knew the brand. And yet, Jell-O is still going, and Kool-Aid is too. But once that brand becomes part of a portfolio, because there's a difference between a financier and an operator, right? You've been both, and some have, but a lot of people can't, are only one or the other. And to have a portfolio, I understand that concept, University of Chicago Finance School and all that jazz. But when you start seeing Jell-O and Kool-Aid and Budweiser and Coca-Cola as just, it's no good anymore, sell that, is there anybody in there that really loves that brand, that really cares about it?
There's nobody that's really doing product development. We actually were talking to a big conglomerate about carving out a great American brand that you would recognize. We're under NDA, so we can't talk about it. But it had just gotten smaller and smaller and smaller over the years. Still a pretty good business, but there's just no product innovation. I mean, this is like a brand that if I asked 10 people, 7 out of 10 of them in the U.S. would know the brand. That's such an incredible opportunity. So we're looking at those types of we're looking at those types of businesses. To your point, actually, what do you think? Why do you think it's important for entrepreneurs to study business history?
Well, it's just, first of all, it's inspiring. It helps you get up in the morning, and if she did that, I can do that. It's full of ideas. All these ideas, they come back around. like everybody talks Steve Jobs being so brilliant, the way he would reveal a product and all like black and oh, here it is. Well, that's exactly what Tom Watson did at IBM in the
Is that
60s, I guess,
right?
with IBM 360. Oh, he took all the reporters in New York City, put them on a train, didn't tell them where they were going, took them up the Hudson River to a warehouse and took them in a dark room and pulled the curtains aside and showed them the IBM System 360, which was where he bet the entire company on this new technology, a whole new system of mainframes. And if it had failed, IBM wouldn't exist today. And he bet the company on it. But no, and you go back, I call him the greatest technology entrepreneur in American history, George Eastman, who gave us Kodak cameras and everything. Um, Steve Jobs, so much of what he did is right out of Eastman's playbook. Eastman was one of the few technologists that understood marketing and branding and came up with a Kodak and the color scheme for his products and ads. And um, nothing's really new. So you get inspired. And if it's in your industry, especially, you'll get new ideas. But new ideas can come from any industry. And there's so many ideas, things that were tried back then that people have forgotten about, you know, and come back. You know, having door-to-door delivery of your bread and your milk was an everyday thing in the 1950s. It all went completely away by the 80s. And now home food and meal delivery is booming, you know.
Yep.
So these things, they come and go. No, so it really, but learning how they think and learning, oh, they made all these mistakes and they still survived. How did they wriggle out of that mess? Or how did they save the company when that happened? And so there's just so much. And there's a lot to be learned from Bezos and Musk and all those people, but they're so heavily written about and to some degree all controversy. There's not a lot of controversy about George Eastman, you know. The man's been dead for 100 years or something, and 90 years or something. And what's been said's been said. And, you know, and what he was and what he did, they're pretty much straight up fact. You know, you can read my biography of him, and there's like no distortion or controversy. Here it is, you know. But they just people love biography. Emerson said all history is biography. You know, People magazine and Us magazine and all that. People love the human story. They love stories. So all my business history is really there's always a biographical tint to it. Some are straight up, this is a biography, but even the ones that aren't. The Beatrice Food story is largely the story of Bill Carnes, the guy who built it, who I met when I was an analyst at Citibank and watched him in action. Big black book, I think a page on each of his like 400 companies. And oh yeah, well they had a good quarter, but their months run a little slow, but last year beat all expectations. Next question. You know, it
Did
was
you read
amazing.
the Reginald Lewis biography? Why should white guys have all the fun? Who
No,
ends up
I
buying
didn't.
Beatrice
I
Foods? Oh, it's
Oh
such a
no,
fun
I
read.
need to. I know. Yeah, he came in later at the
Yeah.
end when it all got messed up.
KKR bought it, and then they spun out this one piece for $1 billion to this guy Reginald Lewis. And I mean, the story of
Yep.
Reginald is fascinating. He was like a
Mm-hmm.
lawyer, and then he was an M&A lawyer, and then he bought this one business that he basically turned like $1 million into $90 million to that one business, and then he said, "Okay, I'm going to go really big," and he bought Beatrice Foods, and
Which had just bought Swift Foods and doubled its size and made it even more complex. I think it was Swift. Um, yeah, no, it became a real mess, and that whole story. And it was a great company, and they were one knocking it out of the park and posting record earnings. And
Mhm.
but he'd drive around and he'd buy two companies on the same day, drive through rural Indiana, buy like a popcorn company or something, buy it on the spot, and drive on down the road and buy another company. And he bought them at the right price, and then he'd pump capital and marketing into them and made small little brands, bigger brands. But after he retired, it all came apart. The finance people took over. You know, I look at the
Yeah.
decline of General Motors. My hometown that had the 27,000 workers has zero now at General Motors. 7 million square feet of empty factory buildings. Most of them been torn down. But you know, after 1937, when there were big strikes, General Motors, and there were strikes at Chrysler and Ford too, big, sometimes violent. Um, there became this wall between labor and management, and nobody crossed that wall. When I was growing up in Anderson, Indiana, Very rarely did somebody who built a car ever become a manager, and very rarely did a manager build a car. Well, the founders of the industry, Mr. Olds of Oldsmobile and Mr. Buick and all these guys, Walter Chrysler, I wrote his biography, they knew they could put a car together themselves, right? And even Alfred Sloan, the greatest of them all that built General Motors, he was an MIT engineer. And these guys could get their hands dirty. Then later, by the late 50s, early 60s, the finance people began to take over General Motors to too great a degree, in my opinion. And the car guys, people really understood cars, less power. But so many factors, including Toyota and Nissan and Honda, and the UAW that contributed to the decline of the auto industry.
The unions.
Yeah.
Gary, I want to ask you about the topic of antitrust. There's this wonderful graphic on your website that shows the companies in the S&P 500. And, at some point it's Ford, biggest, baddest company. And then at some point it decreases, and General Motors and Walmart comes up.
Oh, yeah. It's a Fortune 500 over time. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you see kind of a natural creative destruction happening. And, now we have Lena Khan, maybe on her way out, in the FTC and the Sherman antitrust. And I'm curious, how important do you think that is in governing companies? Or do you think, these things are just going to happen naturally anyways?
Yeah, no, you're always going to get a straight answer from me. So on another site, the Archbridge Institute, which is a think tank out of Washington, that I've written a lot for. In fact, a lot of the biographies I write are first published there and then on our website. But I wrote a piece there called Why We Shouldn't Trust Antitrust. And that was my major in college. George Stigler, Nobel Prize-winning economist, was focused on what they call industrial organization, which is antitrust, monopoly, all that. And that's been my favorite subject academically since I was 13 or 14, started studying mergers and all these merger ways. And in that essay, I can send you a link, you can share it with your folks. I basically say they should do away with antitrust. I have never seen any evidence that it has ever done anything to make life better for the American people. And that's a very extreme position, to be frank. I think it's backed by evidence. In my article, I go through case after case, AT&T, Microsoft, General Motors, IBM, smaller companies that I was more intimately familiar with, about where antitrust just screwed things up. And what it is you have these government bureaucrat lawyers, and first of all, they don't know how to define industry. So when they had Bezos in testifying in front of Congress a couple of years ago, and he said, look, we're smaller than Walmart. We have real competition. Well, some of the members of Congress laughed at him, saying, well, no, we're just talking online here. It's you against Etsy. And he said, but that's not my real world.
Right.
Well, they didn't listen to him. Well, they're always looking, when the department store. So I work for these big department stores, and say we had a big store in Rochester, New York. I'm inventing that. And we wanted to buy the one in Syracuse. Oh, let's go through a year of antitrust hearings, Well, the whole friggin' department store industry was going into the collapse, right? Walmart, but worse than Walmart really is TJ Maxx and Marshall's, Ross stores kind of bashing their heads in market share wise. And the Gap and Old Navy didn't help either, And it's just when this industry is losing, and you're worrying about this, We're worried about Walmart and Kmart. But you see it over and over where they misdefine the industry, but then they always look backwards. They're always, well, you did this and you did that. The only way a company gets them, there are almost no monopolies. There are no monopolies. Even Google and search is like 80%. That's not a monopoly. Monopoly is 100%. These are oligopolies. Now, 80% is really high. That's not significantly higher than what Eastman Kodak achieved in film. They probably had a 70%, at least U.S. and maybe global market share in that category, one of the highest market shares ever achieved by any company. The only way you maintain that is by better quality. The only way a monopoly stands is if it's government-backed. When the U.S. government basically had a deal with AT&T that, you are the nation's phone company. You have 80% of the telephones. You handle all the long distance, even for all your competitors. And as long as you don't raise your prices too much, you're cool. I mean, it was basically Pan American Airways. That was basically U.S. government, U.S. State Department saying, you are the official carrier for the United States outside of the United States. Pan Am was not allowed to fly people between two U.S. cities until the 1980s. They only flew overseas. But for a long time, almost no other American airline was allowed to fly overseas. TWA broke the crack in the late 1940s. But still, Delta and American and United did not fly outside the U.S. except, they flew to Puerto Rico, maybe Mexico City, maybe Canada. They weren't going to Europe or Asia. But that was a deal between the government. So when the government says, yeah, we're behind this and we'll have passed laws to protect you. And so often antitrust laws work to protect the incumbents because they're the ones with the lawyers and the lobbyists and the big loudspeakers and the donations, right? And so,
what's an example of that?
Well, the airline industry, for 40 years from when the post office put in the rules about how the airline industry worked, I've got a video of the history of the airline industry on our website that goes through all this, from the 30s through the 70s till Jimmy Carter deregulated transportation in America. He and Albert Kahn, his antitrust guy. There were no new airlines created, right? There were none. No ones across state borders. You can create within a state like Southwest Airlines did in Texas and PSA did in California, Pacific Southwest Airlines, which really the inspiration for Southwest Airlines. You couldn't cross state lines. And then Carter deregulated buses, trucks, railroads, and airlines, all of them. And all of a sudden you had all these new airlines and Southwest could fly everywhere. And then, of course, Spirit and Frontier and a bunch of others. And prices have come down. Safety's gone up. Crash rates have gone way, way down. The industry's fine. Now, it's got lots of issues, and we can all bitch about the prices and this and that. But, hey, it functions. It works. It gets Americans everywhere. It's an incredible system, actually. Mm-hmm. But no, and breaking up, I used to joke, well, how are you going to break up Amazon? You're going to say all the products are A through M are one company and M through Z is going to be the other company. Now, yeah, you can split off AWS. And, you could say Google never should have bought YouTube or they got to get rid of Chrome. Hey, Sam Walton said, the government can't fire us. Our competition can't fire us or drive us out of business. Nobody can hurt us except our customers. Our customers are the only ones that can fire us. And we look at these things and we think they're like, oh, Google, Meta, it's forever. Well, come on, look at Yahoo and look at MySpace, look at Sears Roebuck, look at Westinghouse Electric, look at CBS. When I did biography, a story of Bill Paley that built that, one of my heroes. Interesting guy, as a lot of these leaders are. Not a perfect man, for sure. If you watch the TV series about Truman Capote and the Paleys and everything that was on TV recently. But the thing is, CBS is one of the great brands of America. The CBSI is one of the greatest longstanding logos in America. The tradition that was developed by Edward R. Murrow and Dan Rather and Walter Cronkite at CBS News. And, it was called the Tiffany Network. It had there's a chart somewhere on our website, 80% of all the top 10 shows for 40 years or something like that were CBS shows. They're just innovative and everything. And now you look at it and, the news thing has kind of gone to rot and the brand is tarnished and the audience is down. They hang in there because they got sports and they got local news. And now Netflix is moving into sports, going to have a Christmas Day NFL game. And there's rumors talking and moving into local news somehow. What got me off on all that, but
I think what I'm hearing is creative destruction is going to happen naturally anyways, and really the FTC's position shouldn't be to block these mergers unless there's some government protection. And then in those scenarios, deregulation will help.
Yes, and the other thing is, not all companies are good, and the thing that people forget is companies are human. Whenever I was on campus when there were marches and everything in the late '60s, and my leftist friends say, oh, all business is evil and they're all crooks, and you got to be a crook to get ahead and everything. And I say, well, what's your dad do? It was mainly dads back then. And it's, oh, well, he's a vice president, so-and-so corporate. I said, well, is your dad the devil? Is he evil? Well, no, of course not, but it's the corporation. All they are is people.
Right.
and therefore human responsibility. And so I think, hey, there are laws against theft. There are laws against fraud. There are laws against, like, if you watch the movies, the average private equity leader has his opponents killed and the brakes changed on their car going downhill. You with me? You know, watch Billionaire, anything like that. You know, anybody with money is just flat out evil. And it's like, well, you know, don't doesn't quite jive with like human reality. Um, uh, no, and none of these companies has got a lock on anything, right? Over time, none of these companies. I actually have an idea for I don't call it a competitor because then people laugh me out of the room. An alternative to Google. I've been trying to get friends interested in it for years. I think it would change the world. I don't think it would take that much capital. Google has gone downhill. I'm a researcher. I'm on Wikipedia and Google almost continuously, and I'm a night owl. So 4 o'clock in the morning, I am flying through. Google has just
Are
gone.
you playing with ChatGPT? Because I spend a lot of my
Oh
time
yeah, no, I don't want
going
anything to
directly to
do with
chat
it.
instead of Google.
Yeah, no. Well, some of in the Google, the Chrome AI, some of those top answers aren't bad, but I still got to check them. And I get 100 emails a day. Say, oh, are you tired of writing? Here, this can help you write great stuff. And I want nothing to do with all that. I'm
Right.
old school. You know, writing is an art form. You know, and it needs to be practiced and developed. But but I understand. Hey, it's going to change medicine. It's going to and autonomous vehicles, all kinds of great stuff. So I'm not saying that, but you won't find me using it. But no, these companies. Hey, study Sears, study General Motors. You know, Jeff Bezos said Amazon will go bankrupt someday, and he's probably right. Now, to me, what's amazing are the survivors. So John Deere was founded in 1837. Colgate-Palmolive was founded in 1806, and Procter and Gamble was founded in 1837.
What
And
makes
John
these
Deere's on
companies
like its
survive for
ninth
so long?
CEO in 180 years, something like that.
What do you think makes these companies stand out and survive for so long? What are
Just there's
some
a short piece, you
defining
know, some of these
qualities?
are on my other website, Hoover's World. There's a short piece called The Six Simple Steps to Building a Successful Enterprise. Six simple steps, I know it starts with. And they do one thing, they focus on it, they do it better and better every day. They always get better, and they're obsessed with their customers. So I forget what the other four were, but hey, it's not that hard. It's not. I have one video somewhere on YouTube about retailing is not rocket science. Try to get all fancy. We got cameras. We can do facial recognition. We can watch. No, friggin' go stand in the store and watch the customers yourself and talk to them. That's the huge advantage that bricks and mortar has over online retailing. And great. And when I meet the head of a retail company, my first question is, what share of your time do you spend in the stores? Because if you got a desk guy or guy that just loves Goldman Sachs and private jets and staying at the Ritz-Carlton, no, get him out of there. Study this guy, Doug McMillan, that runs Walmart. Just watch him. Watch him in his CNBC interviews. It's always in a store. They're the ones I've seen. He's always shirt sleeves. He's always first name. And you can tell. I mean, he's like, okay, let's get this interview over with. I see it's a box of Tide that's fallen off the shelf over here. You know, he's like, restaurant industry. Okay, nobody that runs a car company today ever built cars, right? Essentially, I'm not far off, even if I'm off a little. I bet you 60 to 70% of the CEOs in the restaurant industry started as waiters or barbacks or cooks. Those people, to be in that industry, to work those kind of hours and with all that hot grease and all the competition and the risks, the people they love it. And when you go dive, and I've spoken on restaurant conferences and stuff, they, you know, get me out of Wall Street. I need to go fix more pizza, you know. And it's just a whole different mindset, you know. It's about care. I remember I was speaking in Australia. I wish I'd remember, but one smart entrepreneur in an entrepreneurs club in Sydney or something. There's only three things to business. I don't remember, but one of them was love, you know. But he was about in the big loving the product, caring, you know, and people come out of business school and stuff, or not, you know, drop out of high school, But I'll say at the same time, you got to care about the product and the customer, but also the people who are successful love business. And a lot of times when I meet with entrepreneurs, including tech entrepreneurs, they don't love business. In other words, if you study Bill Gates, you know that guy loves signing a sale, right? If you study Steve Jobs, right? And if you study Bill Paley at CBS or Henry Luce at Time Life magazines and Fortune and Sports Illustrated, that's all in one video. Both is like Luce was a poet. He won poetry contest at Yale, and he was a kind of sullen, isolated guy. Most people didn't really like working for him, but they knew he was a genius and he had all these great ideas for magazines. But at the same time, he really liked making a sale. And he liked a big advertiser coming in and saying, "Oh, we'll take the back cover of Life magazine for the next year." I mean, he loved the transaction of dealing with other people and making deals, and so, because you can go too far with deals. People that I remember Warren Buffett talking about, why did you invest in used car lots and car dealers? He said, oh, it's a whole different industry. He said, but there's opportunities there. He said, but those guys, their whole life is about making deals, whether it's on a car or their own company. They're getting an extra nickel, and he said, so that's just the way they play the game. So yeah, we bought into it and we understand that. Whereas these other industries aren't, that mindset. But really loving business, loving the numbers. There's never been a great merchant that didn't do numbers in their head. I'm not real far off when I say that. I have to kind of watch it because I have students that aren't real good with numbers in their head and they want to be merchants. But hey, man, I used to work for these guys, these buyers, and these old timers say, oh, that dress at that hem length and that color in that size, I can sell about 12,500 of those over 90 days. I mean, they just knew, right? Yeah. And also, the thing I preach is everything you look at, find the data, but before you find the data, guess. What do you think it's going to be? One of our bookstores, I think, I bet you it did 20 grand yesterday. Well, then I look and it did 18, or it did 22, or it did 9, or it did 40. And you say, oh, I'm always low. And through that process, you learn, right? Yeah. And because I'm finding it can be real hard with some of my entrepreneurs I mentor. Say, show me a 5-year plan. Well, how do I know where it's going to be in 5 years? Well, put a number down. Well, how would I even guess? No, you got to friggin' guess, right? You got to put something on the wall. You got to have something to aim for, think about, or learn from, And so the whole process of projecting and what's my future look like, and that can be very hard. And in entrepreneur, I always say every entrepreneur is buried. Every successful entrepreneur has a do list that no human should want to take on, right? But it's a matter of taking the time out. I mean, we're all buried when the brush fire. So what you got to do tomorrow morning and all this, and an employee that's about to quit, and you're getting a divorce, and your life's a mess, and you're out of money, and you all got. But to take that 5 minutes a day to read The Economist magazine, or to read the Wall Street Journal, or to read a business history article, or that one day a week, or that Sunday afternoon once a week. Just Bill Gates used to have Think Week, and he'd go off in the woods for a week because I knew a woman who worked for him and would pick the books, and they weren't business books. He'd read anthropology and sociology and try to understand the world as a whole. It's just carving out that 5% of your life or whatever to think longer term. To have a strategy. I'm kind of hyped up about that because I got a couple of mentees right now, and sometimes it's like against the brick wall. Well, I'd like to see your 5-year plan. Okay, well, give me a 3-year plan. Well, how about the next year by month? And you got even Jack Welch. I'm not his biggest fan. I think he was a smart guy in a lot of ways, but even he said you have to balance the long term and the short term, and that's a challenge.
I want to finish here with our time talking a little bit about your book collection. I know you built one of the largest business book history collections.
Books in general. Yeah, probably half business, half not. Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay. What was that process? How did you pick books for the collection? How did you decide what goes in there?
Yeah, I'm a book lover since I was a kid. Really, reference library. My goal when I was a kid was I wanted to be able to look up anything and find the answer without going to the library. So it was really reference books on different subjects, but obviously interested in business history. But like architecture and art was probably, well, it was real big. I loved trains, planes, and cars. So I had a old hotel building, 25 rooms. Each room was a different subject. So I think business was probably 6 of the 25, maybe. I'd have to figure it out. Retailing had its own room. I just love books.
You
They're
used an old
affordable, they're
hotel as
portable.
the library, basically.
At my
Is that right?
house, yeah. And then 2 years ago, it burned to the ground in 8 hours, and I lost 70,000 books.
Oh
So I've
no.
rebuilt since then. I'm back up to maybe 4,000 books, maybe. I got the key business history ones out of the way. But no, books. I mean, the whole world is in there. And then people will say, oh, but all that information's online now. My estimate is 70% of the information that was in my library is not online, is not on the web. A lot of it's under copyright, so it's not on the web. A lot of great books aren't on it. And then a lot of them are just real old and didn't make Google Books.
Are you rebuilding that collection now that it?
Yeah, I'm up to maybe 4,000 books. You can see a few behind me, although those are all European travel books. I love geography. I love atlases. Atlases were the first thing I collected as a kid. World atlases, U.S. road atlases. And I still do. I carry in my car like 1940s road maps to see my 3,000-mile road trip I took in October. I want to say less than 300 miles was on interstate. I hit the
You're
back roads,
taking back
including
roads.
gravel roads, dirt roads in Arkansas mountains, which are stunningly beautiful. Have you been up to Springdale?
I haven't, unfortunately.
Oh, you
No,
got to
my
go.
business
You got
put
to
me way
go.
out
Just
there.
the whole thing is a trip because it's these, 4 little towns. The biggest one's 70,000 or something altogether. It's like 500,000 or whatever it is. Yeah, it's more than that. It's like 700,000. The airport there now is busier than the Little Rock Airport, but it's, Bentonville, Rogers, Springdale, and Fayetteville. And Fayetteville has the State University, which they told me over half the students are Texans.
Wow.
Texans get in-state tuition at
Oh, that's
Arkansas.
great.
Apparently, they have a
That's
deal of the two states. That was interesting.
that's a good deal.
Uh,
That is really interesting.
yeah, but it's just beautiful. The mountains outside there. I stayed up in a cabin that was near the highest point between the Rockies and the Appalachians and the Ozark Mountains.
I think I'm gonna go check it out this year or next year,
Oh,
early
you got
next
to.
year.
Yeah, but
Well, do you
it's
remember?
just real different, and it's real
Yeah.
happening, But it's these 4 small towns. It's not like a downtown for all of them.
Do you remember what's the one book that impacted you most that you could share?
Well, I always say my favorite book's The World Almanac because I just love data. I just read. Robert Wood, I wrote his biography, the guy that really made Sears the greatest bricks and mortar retailer on earth. He read a page every night before he went to bed of the statistical abstract of the government, which is no longer published, but a similar book. But, My Years with General Motors by Alfred P. Sloan. Bill Gates once said, if you're only going to read one book about business, that's the book you got to read. It really shaped my life and way of viewing the world, and still, as Gates said, one of the most important business books ever written. And Sloan took General Motors from being a distant second to Henry Ford and blew past him and really built what was at the time the world's greatest company. There's another article on the website about the 3 greatest companies in American history, and I say Pennsylvania Railroad, General Motors, and IBM, and give the reasons. And then we can debate about what's the greatest company today, I have to admit I'm leaning towards Walmart. I always backed away from saying that because I'm so linked to retailing and love it so much. But on that road trip, I was in a bunch of Walmarts, and I've been watching them. I go into a lot of the stores. But also I go into Target and Dollar General and all the other stores, Macy's, Neiman Sachs, all of them. But that company is, 2 million jobs. And my guess, Walmart has created something like 100 jobs a day for 60 years, something like that.
It's amazing.
7 days a week. But my guess is they've created more $60,000 plus jobs than any other company has created total jobs. That the number of people at Walmart that make over 60, you might even say over 100, that's more than total employment at Tesla or something like that. Mm-hmm. If I'm off, I don't think I'm way off. People forget Walmart managers make a lot of money. Assistant managers make a lot of money. And there are a lot of people in Bentonville that make a lot of money. A lot of people gotten rich on the stock. And there's so many. And you don't have to have a graduate degree or anything. I mean, it's the most wonderful opportunity for somebody, high school dropout or high school diploma, but has energy and drive and wants to do a good job. They can become millionaires in that company. And now all over the world, the huge in Mexico, multi-billion-dollar operation.
Every once in a while, I check in on how their e-commerce business is doing. I remember in 2018, I think it was like 4% of the business, and I just looked it up, and it's closer to 13% of the business. I'm sure COVID helped quite a bit. It looks like COVID doubled their
And
size.
in the last quarter, their online was up 27% over the last year. So it's been growing much, much faster than Amazon.
Yeah.
And I believe in competition. Any good reason. Sam Walton, he is buddies with all his competitors. We're all in it together. It's kind of like when you see pro sports, the NFL players that pat each other on the butt for the other team, because they all went to college together. They're in it because they love football. The NBA players are in it because they love basketball. Us retailers are in it because we love retailing. And we therefore like other retailers, including our competitors, right? And respect them and learn from them. Yeah.
Gary, this has been wonderful. I really appreciate you taking this time
This
with
is
me and
fun.
sharing some of these lessons.
I'm up for talking about all this jazz anytime, and retailing or mergers or business history.
Well,
There's so much to learn.
what are some ways people can keep up with what you're doing or get in touch with you if they want? And,
Well, yeah. And I invite anybody who's listening or watching, my email is Gary Hoove, so my name without the ER, at msn.com, Microsoft Network. The website is americanbusinesshistory.org, and it's just full of articles. And the minute you go there, I think it'll say sign up for our newsletter. That's free. I haven't been very productive over the last year. I hope to crank that up. So go ahead and sign up for the newsletter. But you can just browse through there, and there's indexes by industry and stuff. And you can a search box. So you can, I want to look at lodging. I want to look at technology. I want to look at transportation or retailing or media. And there's just a lot of stories to browse through. And they're categorized. My own stories of my success at Bookstop and my failure at Travel Fest are under a heading called Show Your History. There's a whole nother section called Charts and Data, and we do these animated charts like you're talking about, showing the rise and fall of the biggest companies, the most valuable companies, the most profitable companies, the biggest employers over the last 30 years. And then separate ones on the rise and fall of the airlines, the rise and fall of the car makers, these animated charts where they're all moving around, very cool stuff.
Well, I think this is a good place to end, Gary. This was wonderful.
Well,
I appreciate you taking the
thanks
time.
for all your time. Yeah. So there's just a lot on there, and links and their book list recommended the best books to read on business history. If somebody wants to understand American business history, the book to start with really is called The Visible Hand by a guy named Alfred Chandler, Chandler. And he was a business historian, I think at Johns Hopkins at first and then at Harvard for years. And he was the greatest business historian we've ever had, in my opinion. And a lot of other people would share that. And just get The Visible Hand by Alfred Sloan. I'm sorry, by Alfred Chandler.
I'm checking it out right now. I'm going to buy it right now.
Oh, yeah, no. And then he wrote other books. He wrote a real good one on the history of technology and computers in America, wrote a big one on the chemical and pharmaceutical industries. He wrote one about international and how Japan and Germany compared with the U.S. called Scale and Scope. But his core book is called The Visible Hand. That's the one to start with. And it is a pretty comprehensive. Now, it's, written in the 80s, I guess. So, it's not going to talk about Musk and everybody. But, boy, to really understand. And the guy, one thing to get into with business history and economic history is social scientists, who I love. If I weren't a retailer, I'd be teaching social sciences. They tend to get caught up in these big trends, like, the affordable car would have come along whether or not Henry Ford existed. It was a trend in society. Well, or there was a shift, or the war caused this, or the Great Depression caused this, and all that's true. And I do believe somebody would have probably come along and done a cheap car if Ford hadn't. But they tend to skip over like the great man theory. If you go back 100 years ago, biographies were the great man theory. There was never anything wrong with the person. As soon as some famous business person died, wrote these things that just like, oh, he was a genius, he was wonderful. And so they went too far. It's called hagiography or something like that. It's all puff. But when doing and dismissing all that, they kind of dropped out the human rule. And yeah, if Elon Musk weren't around, we get to Mars sooner or later, but maybe it'd be much later. Maybe we wouldn't get there at all. I always say Walt Disney is my favorite entrepreneur, and the one thing I give him a little edge for, because I really liked a lot of the great men and women entrepreneurs, but the little edge is because he did things that really might not have happened if he hadn't existed. I mean, there was nobody really begging for Disney World, and that was a really out of the box idea. Even with Disneyland in existence, Disney World was a whole different trip. And I think there's a good shot. My friends that created Hoover's with me, we would debate this. I think Disney World might be the highest revenue single economic entity in the world. In other words, the biggest department store in the world does about $2 billion a year in sales in one building. It's in Tokyo. The biggest factory in the world in dollar revenue is maybe the Boeing 747 plant. They're cranking those down now. But I think Disney World does maybe 4 or 5 billion. You can make a case that a Harvard or a Berkeley is right up there, because some of those are multi-billion-dollar institutions in one physical location. But Disney World is just this huge economic, it could easily be a freestanding company. And of course, they build them around the world. But Walt, so on my trip to Missouri, I went to the boyhood home of J.C. Penney, the house with no indoor plumbing that he grew up in. And then I went to the farm that Walt Disney grew up in. They're not that far from each other in northern Missouri, central northern Missouri. And I'm there on this farm by myself around sunset. All you could hear were the birds and the passing freight trains. Well, Walt Disney, growing up, he lived there from the time he was 4 till he was 9. He fell in love with all the animals and the wildlife, and that showed up in the silly symphonies and all his cartoons. And he fell in love with trains, and that resulted in the Main Street train at Disneyland. And he had a train in his backyard, big enough he could sit on it and ride it. He had a whole train yard in his backyard. And he said the most important things that changed his life happened in those 5 years he lived on that farm. So I'm standing there by myself under his dreaming tree where he used to draw under it. It died, but they planted a new one. And I'm like, whoa, kind of touching history.
Yeah.
And you can go to Marceline, Missouri, go to the museum, and then they'll tell you where that farm is. And, you can have it all to yourself,
That's so cool.
But to really, how did he think? Read about him, how he thought and how he was never satisfied. And they aren't perfect, I mean, some of them really. Isaac Singer, the sewing machine guy, I think I called him the most evil guy I've ever written about.
How come?
He had like 4 families, and he got in big trouble when he's riding in the fanciest carriage in Manhattan, because he was super wealthy, with his mistress, and he happens to go by his wife and the kids. So he flees to England or something. I mean, he was not a good man. Luckily, he had a partner who hated him, who was a good businessman. Made them both rich. Sewing machines. Think about that. How they changed the world. And just stop and think. What an incredible. And the McCormick and the Reaper. How that 90% of us worked in agriculture in America. And he and the other farm implement makers changed all that. And we're now better fed than ever with 3% working in farming. And that's what's going to happen with manufacturing. I mean, it sounds bad, I guess, but although our manufacturing production is way up, we produce more stuff than we've ever produced. We do it with fewer people. It's called automation. It isn't just about China.